Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome SAP NS2 Chief Executive, Mark Testoni.
Good morning. You know, I felt like I needed to come out and do the river dance or something with that music going on. Well, thank you all for attending our 8th little soiree or whatever we call this thing now, but it's kind of interesting to watch this change and grow. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about division today, but how about them gnats? There's not a lot we can agree about in this town, particularly inside the ring called the Beltway, but we can agree about the gnats for the most part, other than maybe the Texas delegations, right? So how exciting is that? You know, I think if they win tonight, in the modern era, which would be, I think I was alive prior to the modern era, but it would be the first team that's ever won a World Series without winning a home game. Think about that. So really exciting stuff, and it's actually unified this town probably as much as anything in a long time. A couple of things up front. First, many of you that have been here, how many of you have been here more than 1 year? Okay. Even some of you aren't even employees of NS2, that's even better. NS2 serves as a program where we train hard to employ veterans and bring them into the IT industry. We have our current class of NS2 serves here. I'd like them to stand up and would you please recognize these veterans. They're struggling reading 6-inch binders of technical manuals, so today is like this huge opportunity for them to be away from that. Also, Fran Townsend, many of you know, was to be our opening keynote this morning. Unfortunately, she got called away at the last minute. We found out late Monday, and we apologize for that. Unfortunately, you're probably stuck with me for an extra 2 or 3 minutes, and then the panel for maybe an extra 10. But she would have loved to have been here, and it's disappointing that she's not here, but she's with us in spirit, and obviously we have General Mattis coming up later, and that's going to be exciting and fun too. So, you know, the team came to me sick. This takes a year to plan this thing. And again, I really want to thank everybody for coming and for the sponsors, and hopefully you'll enjoy this content today. We took a little different pivot. The team came to me with this concept of division. You know, and I think we all recognize that. First, they came to me with this thing called narrowing the gap, I think. Then it was minding the gap, and I thought maybe we were talking about the British subway system. But we came to this narrowing the divide because, I mean, we look around us and there's a ton of divisions, and I'm going to talk about a few of them. When you have divisions, there's kind of more polarized conflict, or it seems like there's been than any time in my lifetime, and it's not just political. It's generational, it's many things. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And what we want to do today is maybe take on a few of those things and see how maybe we can address them through technology and better collaboration between government and the commercial industry. So that's really the theme today. And I think the video kind of captured it a lot. It always is fascinating to me that we actually had prohibition in this country. You know, when you see that picture of those guys knocking those beer barrels and all that stuff's coming out, beyond the fact that I hope the heck it wasn't any Blanton's bourbon, you know. I mean, when you think about how 3/4 of the states actually passed an amendment to ban alcohol, how bad the alcohol problem must have been in this country. But, you know, fortunately we got by that. It created a whole lot of set of externalities, and those are the kinds of things I think we have to be careful of as we approach the future as well. So narrowing divide. So underlying the divisions today, I think, and the video captures this a little bit, is the amazing speed of change and innovation. I mean, think about, I grew up, we didn't even have a television when I was very young. And to think about what we have in this society today and the amount of data and what's on the table with 5G, and I don't think we really comprehend what 5G is going to mean. I mean, anybody remember 2004 that's in here? A few of you might have been around then, right? If we were sitting here doing this conference in 2004, we would be talking about people would be, instead of on their smartphones, like I see several, they'd be on their BlackBerries. And if somebody said smartphone, you kind of got a curious look. So that's 15 years ago. Think of what has changed in our life and how we as individuals can accomplish so much. I think we're going to see that same kind of change in the next 15 years, maybe more accelerated as we look at quantum computing, but particularly 5G and the redistribution of the internet, IoT. Now that's the good news. But the challenges are, we see, some of the divisions and some of the challenges we have in this country really are driving, or some of this technology is what's really driving some of the challenges through the speed by which we react. Think about how fast the reaction was on Twitter last night to that umpiring call in the 7th inning. Think about that. Now, in the old days, back in, say, 1965 World Series, it might have been in a newspaper, and most of the country would have found out maybe the day or two later, right? If it was as late as these games go now, it would have been 2 days later because it missed the deadline for publishing cutoff, right? So just think about those things. So that speed is both sides of the sword, and it's really important that we get to it, we deal with it. So let's talk a little bit about some of these divisions, just briefly. I mean, the most obvious one, I think, is the political one, and we live in a town of politics, right? And it's not just a political, U.S. political, it's a geopolitical aspect to this. So think about most of us that were around during the Cold War. It was really a sphere of the Soviet Union and the good guys, right, the U.S. And there were a lot of other minor things. The Chinese were there, but they weren't maybe the power. Now you think about today and the emergence of China in the last 40, really 50 years. I do remember 1969 when Nixon really opened the overtures to China. When you think about that, China was like North Korea in the 1960s. You young folks don't realize that, but North Korea is kind of a small country. China, like 1 billion people, was like North Korea is today. And so, but now they've risen largely because of economics and decision making to be a real peer ally of ours, or peer competitor, cooperative competitor of ours that we have to deal with. But then the politics internally, probably the most distressing. We look at, for the last few years, the last maybe 6 to 10 years or so, it's really felt like the polarization has gotten a lot greater. I think we all feel that way, or many of us feel that way, and we seem to get less done on a national level. Maybe that's good in some ways from a standpoint of legislation. Maybe we don't need, but it is a challenge. But we have a lot of history of this, and it may seem like it's worse right now, but there's probably not been a worse time in this country than the period that led up to the Civil War. And the post-Civil War was just, I mean, if you read historically, I was not around for that. Some of you may think I was, but I'm not around for that. But it was really bad, and thankfully they didn't have the technologies that we have today to be able to communicate with each other. Can you imagine those issues being debated on Twitter and Instagram, and I can't even imagine. So, but the debate has been toxic in recent years, and what's probably the most concerning thing to me as an individual is that we've allowed it to spill into the national security arena pretty significantly, which is an area that most of us in this room are pretty. Typically in the past, we kind of kept it at the water's edge, right? We're no longer at the water. I mean, we're openly debating pretty significant things, and that's for a variety of reasons. But I think the technology underpinning is one of those. We have to address that. In other areas, so that's the political landscape. Obviously, something we're all familiar with. Generational is another one. How many Gen Zs are in the audience? Not too many. I have a few hands. Who knows what a Gen Z is? Oh, okay. 3 other people knew, and there was 1 on the other side over there. Millennials. So, I mean, most of those around government, although we're doing a better job, I think, of attracting talent, I mean, there are a lot of divisions between the generations. There always have been, but they just seem to be maybe a little bit more acute right now. Who's a baby boomer? I'd like to admit that I wasn't. I'm not above baby boomer level. I'm not going to look at anybody else that might not be a baby boomer that might be in the audience. But, we were kind of defined by America's greatness after World War II, right? Who remembers 1969 and the moon launch? I mean, we were riveted by that, right? NASA programs we thought were about going to the moon, but they were really basic research that drove a lot of technology we have today. Gen X was kind of, who's the Gen X crowd in here? There's a few more of those. Yeah, I see that. So Gen X was kind of that generation that really, the new news wave came through, cable TV. You know, we had no TV, and then we had black and white when I was growing up, and the channel changer, right? Just think of how much weight we would lose if we had to still get up and turn the stations just think about that. I mean, that's actually what's driven the obesity problem in this country. But Gen X, and you know, was kind of the beginning of all this. MTV, Top Gun, CNN was born, right? 24/7 news. Think about how that's changed the world. And what was 24/7 news looking for? Something bad to talk about, right? They needed another crisis, right? So that, you know, clearly a different background than those of us that were born as part of the boomers. And then the millennials and Gen Z, kind of you know, many of them are defined more, and we see them in the workplace. And today I had some stuff done. We're approaching 30% of our workforce at NS2. I'm sure we're seeing that in the contractor community and even in government. Different motivations. You know, the idea to a millennial or a Gen Z person that you can't go into your office with a cell phone is not scalable long term for us. We've got to, why is this important? We've got to be able to attract these folks into our business area. And I say it's our collective business, whether we're in government, or we're in the contractors community supporting, or commercial companies supporting it. So, I mean, these are significant things. Generational is another one. Probably the one that really concerns me the most, because this is what the fabric of our country is built on, is economic. There's a lot of data that would suggest that the middle class in our country is being squeezed. And I think there's kind of a feeling of that. Today we are roughly 17% of the world's GDP, still the biggest player. We are the great world consumer. And it's largely because we have this huge middle class that was built really off the Industrial Revolution, accelerated post-World War II. But things are changing. We're no longer an industrial power, at least, you know. We have a lot of folks there's been a fallout of that change. We have a skills gap. I mean, NS2 serves as a way we address, you know, it's a small way we try to address a skills gap, but we have millions of people. And we see kind of the implications of this in second and third order effects, like the opioid crisis in parts of our country and decaying cities. We've got to deal with this. It's not about just bringing jobs back to the U.S. that maybe were transported from an industrial perspective. I'm not saying some of that isn't important, but we've got to reskill our workforce for this information economy that's been growing for the last 40 years. If we don't address that, that's a real challenge. And what's one of the, one of the underlying factors to that is kind of the way we train people. We're still operating a 17th, 18th century education system that says we have to send everybody to college. You go back a couple generations, probably less than 20% of the population went to university, or even less today, but there's a lot of pressure socially to go to school. We've got to look at these things. We've got to look at how we spend our money as a country. I mean, we've got probably 1 million jobs in IT alone in this country that we can't source right now because of skills, yet we have all these people that aren't employed. So we need more programs. Had the opportunity yesterday to meet with a company by the name of Catalyte, and they're actually doing this for, you know, they're basically creating engineering talent for profit and reskilling people. So there are places like that in NS2 serves. We have to do this more, and this is a problem the private sector is going to have to solve, with support from the government, in my mind, not one that the government's going to solve. So just, you know, huge. And then lastly, what we would call in this room kind of the innovation tech gap. You know, the U.S. government has led for many, many years, or led post-World War II, the innovation. I mentioned NASA a few minutes ago. But most of the R&D dollars today aren't coming from the government. If you went back to the 1960s, probably 40% of the R&D dollars in this country were inspired or pushed by the federal government. Today, I don't know what the number is, but I would say it's probably less than 5%, maybe 2%. Where's the R&D coming from? Commercial industry. How well really has the federal government gotten along with kind of the technology centers of this country in places like Silicon Valley, Boston, Texas, Austin, parts of New York? Not so well. We haven't done a really good job with that. We've done some, there's been some notable things, but it hasn't been great. So we've got to figure out how to do that. We've had a lot of ceremonial discussion about this. We've had SecDefs and leaders going out and trying to bridge this gap. We have to do more. A lot of it gets down to the working level, the folks in this room and others. And we got to get away from some of the trappings. Nobody wants to talk about acquisition policy because it's hard to change, but the reality is that we don't need, MESARC kinds of things to be able to agilely react to the requirements when you look at cybersecurity. So these are really big things, and these are gaps we have to deal with. And there's also a subset of a gap in there related to, security and innovation. And I mentioned, young people wanting to go into their office with their iPhone, and they can't if they work in certain agencies, right? We got to fix that problem. I guarantee it'll be technically available to fix, certainly in a 5G world, but we've really got to fix those things. And we also have to figure out how we really enable and deploy technologies rapidly in a secure environment. We're going to talk about that today because we've got some examples, and some of our partners have examples for doing that. So beyond, probably wasn't as entertaining as a monologue at a late night monologue, but I'm sorry that Fran wasn't here to kind of deliver some of this, but that's what we're here to talk about today. So hopefully, when you get through the day, and we've got some really good panels, one focused kind of on the geopolitics of cyber, and another one on the skills gap, and then there's some breakout sessions on everything from how do you use commercial technologies to unify data layers and how clouds can securely do things. So we're going to get at all these things a little bit, but hopefully by the end of this, we've picked up like an inch more of understanding, and maybe we can start to broker and bridge these divides, because ultimately, we're all on one team here. We're just like the Nats. We're just a bigger team, right? And we got to put aside some of the differences and start focusing on us, because we have generations behind us, and frankly, if we don't do this right, the bad guys are going to win. And the last thing we can afford to do is have that. Thank you all for your time.